So what were you telling her?
Oh no, I was like having just like a really crappy day, and I was like, oh, I feel like I wasted like the past 4 hours doing nothing. I was like playing like Mario and watching like YouTube for like 4 hours, and I was like, I forget what she said, but she said, don't think of it as you just wasted 4 hours. Think of it as you spent 4 hours recharging so that you could study better tomorrow. And I was like, okay, I guess I really struggled with like trying to accept that, but I'm like, I guess maybe that's just the most pragmatic way to frame quote unquote wasting my 4 hours not studying. I'm really lucky because, like I said, my right now my preceptor's super chill, and this month is really chill and pretty easy to study. But I was still like, okay, I guess I could reframe it
Yeah,
that
I
way.
think what and for the folks that are listening right now, we're just sort of talking about like random life stuff, and he was talking about how his girlfriend is trying to help him rethink, taking like a day off, doing things that you actually enjoy doing, even if it's just like mindful things that feel unproductive, right? Like for me, I feel as though, especially with people that are high like achievers such as yourself, like we tend to find value only in avenues where we can see like a sort of direct translation into our craft or into like a monetary value, right? But
Yeah.
it's also sort of important for us to realize, and this is something that this chapter also explores too, the like a deeper meaning, or like a different lens when it comes to value. Like for me personally, like some one of like the something that just gets me like to lick my lips when I just sort of think of the idea. I know that's a really, amazing image for the listeners at home, but like something that gets me really excited is when someone tells me that, like, oh, what you're doing is a waste of time, or like, oh, there's no opportunity for you here. Like those two things, like finding value in places where no one else finds value, and then also creating or finding opportunities where no one else can seem to find them too. That's what gets me like so excited, because it's like 99% of other people will write it off as like, oh, I've wasted my time, and now I'm just going to feel bad about it for myself, and then just like basically just feel sorry for myself, and then delude myself into this thinking that everything that I have to do has to like be translated into like a monetary value, or it helps me check off one thing on a list of things that I need to do for the week. And it's like, nah, man, like if you want to watch that YouTube video, watch that YouTube video. But at the same
Mhm.
time, it's also like push yourself into thinking, like when it comes to like the end of the day reflections, push yourself into thinking, what is it that I gained from like this video that I couldn't have gained like from spending another hour studying, or like uh, reading a book, or learning a language or something like that. It's like maybe you got a new perspective into like comedy, and then now you can use that new perspective to like get laughs, or make new friends or something like that. Or it's like, oh, I've helped myself, like I've helped improve one very small aspect of my life. So it's like no drop runs off the table. You know what I mean? Where it's like, even in the things that you find to be useless or futile, there's always value to be obtained. You know, and
Yeah.
that's just my perspective, and I think that's what your girlfriend is trying to tell you too.
That reminds me, I don't know. I forget. I have no idea what episode it is, but I remember on a Jocko episode, Echo, they're talking about discipline, and Echo's like, yeah, just the other day, I got stuck in the line at the grocery, and had forgotten to grab a cart, and so I was holding like the grocery basket, and it was like really heavy. So I just thought to myself, oh, I'm gonna develop some discipline in the grocery line and just hold this like half half curled basket of groceries that's heavy and just discipline it and be like, I'm not gonna let this go back down until I get to the checkout. And so like taking moments like that where even if it's stupid, just being trying to think like, oh, how can I do this? It's like, oh, I had to park down way farther down the street than I used to. It's like, okay, well, you know, I get more time to listen to a podcast or carry my heavy groceries further, so I'm building muscle
Mm.
mass.
Yeah, I agree, and it's sort of like I feel as though a lot of people find roundabout ways of saying this too, especially within like modern day, like the way modern technology has affected our like life experience, where it's like everything we do has to be everything that we do or accomplish has to have incorporated the most efficient way possible for us to achieve the end goal. Where it's like sometimes that sort of that sort of eliminates the space for like innovation, or it eliminates the space for us to create or find new opportunity, right? Because a lot of times opportunity comes when there's like the existence of space that has yet to be filled, right? So on one hand, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of utility, and there's a lot of like value, and it's not to say that we should abolish entirely the need for like expediency, right? But it's also like, what are we giving up? Like almost everything has like a sort of cost benefit analysis. What are we giving up when we sacrifice those extra like 2 minutes like at the grocery store? Maybe we took away 2 minutes of time that we really needed to reflect on a day when there's literally nothing else that could have been done. And then you could say, oh, you could create that time and space elsewhere. And it's like it's kind of harder for you to do when you have to create that time for yourself rather than the time presents itself to you, and then you're like, oh, what can I do with this? You know, um, yeah. But that's really exciting stuff. And yeah, so for all those listening, we're starting this week off. You may have noticed we took an extra week off in between just because number one, I was feeling kind of lazy, admittedly, and also number two, like because I was lazy, I knew that like I couldn't have the conversation that I feel as though this chapter deserves, because I truly believe that not only is this like my favorite chapter, but I also believe that this is sort of like Dr. Peterson's magnum opus, or like the entire reason why he created this book. It's sort of centered on this point of pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient, you know? And one of the most exciting things for me about this chapter is that like I've always had questions within my own mind about the nature of good and evil, and how humanity sort of fits into that picture. And the great thing about this chapter is that like it doesn't necessarily give me the answers that I'm looking for, or like there's definitely room for further development and extrapolation, but at the same time it's also like it gives me a reference frame, or it gives me like the tools that I need to have better conversations about such a topic. I think one of the things that that sort of struck me when I was a kid, especially growing up in like a Catholic school setting, because that's sort of how I came up, is that like my religion teacher said something that was like so. I thought it was so innocuous and silly at the time, and me and all my friends like at the time thought it was really silly too. But it's sort of the idea that life is pain and then you die, and that's sort of like that's the problem that this chapter tries to address here, where it's like the idea that life is suffering. What are we going to do about it? And then later on in this chapter, Dr. Peterson adds a new a new layer to the issue. Not only is life suffering, but life is sometimes also plagued with evil that humans inflict upon other humans merely for the sake of producing meaningless suffering. And I think one of the things is that like the sort of the nature of humanity is to try and find like a meaning, or like a rationalize the existence of such suffering. I think what
Yeah, I think it's really building. Oops.
sorry, continue.
I think it's really. Oh, I was gonna say. I don't know if there's a lag or something going on, but it's really well building off that last chapter, because there's definitely that short section in the last one, talking about that. I can't remember that criminal's name, but then Tolstoy's like response to seeing that the world is meaningless and suffering. And I think it went through the four of them. I can't remember the four, but it was like, hedonism, or, you know, you sit there in nihilism, and then the last one's like destruction. And I think that's what Jordan Peterson's trying to build. He's like, here's your fifth kind of option, is to find meaning even though it is suffering in the world.
Yeah, I agree. One of the cool things that I heard him say,
Which I
like,
think,
hello. Yeah, so one of the cool things that
yeah,
I've heard
I'm
him say
sorry.
is that, like, yeah, I think there is a little bit of a lag going on here, but we'll try to we'll try to make it work. But one of the coolest things that I've ever heard him say is that, like, naive people aren't better than people looking at, like, the darkness in the world, right? Like, they're only naive, or they do what people perceive to be as good just by default, or like it's just the
Mhm.
virtue of their morality at the time. They don't know better. When it's like, oh, when you start to see these options laid before you, just purely based on virtue of being a human being, where it's like, oh, we can cut corners, we can improve our lot in life, but it comes at, like, the expense of another human being, in a meaningless way. So, like, I think the prototypical example he gives here is slavery, and I love how he acknowledges, like, the validity of slavery, and that's not to say slavery is the right thing to do. It's like, let's give the devil its due. Slavery made a lot of labor, like, a lot more affordable, and it enhanced the means of production for generations of people, until people realized, oh, hey, this is fundamentally wrong. It's wrong to subjugate people against their will to do something that improves our lot in life, but at the expense of theirs, without their say or input.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and ironically, I think I've heard this from several sources now, is that ironically slavery is actually in the long run less beneficial, and that's why technically the North won the Civil War, is because they were taking the easy route with slavery, but without it, um, you have to innovate and improve your like production line, because you're like, oh, I have to pay this person either way. So if I can get that one person to be better at producing whatever I'm trying to produce, that'll get better. So they had to really adapt, which I think, if you go from the metaphorical of this chapter, is like, oh, if you don't take the easy route of just like having pleasure in your life and not just like avoiding all suffering, but rather making deliberate sacrifices, you are going to keep improving yourself rather than taking the road uh normally traveled, and take that less traveled road.
Yeah, I
But
think.
I was going to ask, because when I was reading, oh, I think there is a pretty good delay.
It's okay. It's working
Um,
out.
I was, I was, I was gonna say, when I was reading the end of the chapter, I was trying to think, why isn't it that most people, um, like kind of, oh, I can't think of the word. Why is it that most people don't address their life and like really deeply contemplate things? Because I think he was starting to get into the end here, and it was kind of like, oh, I he went through this like dark kind of the path through the underworld in like the 1980s, where he was like trying to figure out stuff, and I was like, oh yeah, like I've had that, where I definitely was like thinking about like deeply about my life, and I'm was wondering what you thought. It's like, is it just people kind of walk through life without thinking, almost like they're an NPC in a video game, or is it some people are just lucky and they find their meaning accidentally and don't have to think about it? I'm just trying to think, why
Yeah.
does it seem like some people have to examine their life, while some of us almost have to like excessively suffer trying to find meaning in it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I feel as though, like, you know I feel as though what we're looking at is sort of like a bimodal thing, where it's like, on one hand, and I suppose I should start with saying something like this, to the extent where it's like, perhaps it's like the circles of people that you find yourself surrounded with, just by nature of, like, calling them friends, they typically tend to think like you too, right? So perhaps it seems like there's like a greater population than it seems, or lesser, just based on like the people you've selected to surround yourself with. And then sort of going back to like your initial question, in my opinion, it's like this, because I feel as though I've definitely lived on both ends of that spectrum. One where it's like, oh, you're living the unexamined life, you're just doing things based on whims and little regard for the future, let alone your own soul. And then on the other hand, it's like you think so much about the possibilities and the moral implications of literally everything that you do that you're almost sort of like frozen by the terror of just, oh, if I do something here, perhaps I'm like infringing on another human being's rights, or taking away from an opportunity from another individual, or stuff like that, where basically you've become the pure intellect, where you think so much that you don't carry out action, versus the other spectrum is you only carry out action without thinking about why the action needs to take place for us to get wherever it is that we want to go. And in my opinion, it's like, obviously the balance exists somewhere in between. And I would venture to say that most people throughout the course of their lives frequently find themselves like fluctuating between those two extremes, but more often than not, like they tend to fall into one camp or the other. So I don't think it's necessarily that like people purely exist as like NPCs or stuff like that, because perhaps they do think about certain issues to a certain extent to the way that you're describing. It's just not the same issues that you've spent your time like invested into like sort of answering. And then the other hand, it's also like I would say a lot of the things that we do, a lot of the things that we do and a lot of the beliefs that we hold, they're typically like learned things. So we've found ourselves like looking at another individual and thinking like, oh, this person has their head on straight. Maybe I should do more of this. What questions are they asking? Maybe I should ask those questions too and see if I can find my own answers. And then sometimes there's just a vacuum, right? Where no one in like say a young person's life has taught them like, oh, these are some these are some moral problems that we have just fundamentally as human beings. Everyone dies, everyone suffers. What the hell is that all about? Maybe they never had anyone to sort of show them the way. But one aspect that I love about this chapter that Dr. Peterson talks about later is that like from a Christian perspective, God will continually find ways to reveal himself to them such that the truth is almost sort of self-evident, And it's like, no matter how hard you run, like if you're raised in any sort of milieu, this is sort of like the idea of seeing signs, or like seeing, getting messages from the universe. It's because you've inherited this sort of lens to interpret the world, and then that mode of thinking helps shape your experience, and then also shapes the way you think.
Yeah, I was gonna say if we talk about my girlfriend again, she's definitely a lot more than I am into the getting signs from the universe, or kind of like that kind of more woo-woo kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think
But
that's just a thing that girls do more so than guys in general. But yeah, I feel you.
I think it's not necessarily that I disagree with her. I think I intellectualize it and go, it's not that you're seeing signs or like the universe speaking to you. It's because of your frame of mind. You see something, and rather than me thinking, oh, this thing happened, so I should do this, it's just you're framed it in a way that like, oh, the universe is guiding me towards this thing, where it's like, I think it's just framing. And so if you structure your worldview around in a certain way, you're going to get guided towards whatever you want to do, and you're going to feel kind of a tug or quote unquote signs that pull you in a certain way. And like I said, I think it's verbiage that we're both using is just different.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it sort of also speaks to like your own inclinations or like dispositions fundamentally as human beings. I feel as though when I hear a person say something about like, oh, this is the universe telling me this, or my higher power is pointing me towards like these decisions in my life. I feel as though these people typically, and this is no injunction against these people, right? But I feel as though when it comes to that, people are typically feel stuck, right? Because it's like, oh, I've been presented with this myriad of either problems or decisions that I have to make with a timeline, and it's like at my point in time right now, I cannot decipher for myself like which option is more valuable or which option leads to the least amount of harm. Versus on the other hand, I feel as though like, and I can sort of empathize with you in the sense that I also tend to intellectualize things way too much. So I feel as though it also gives us like this sort of illusion of control where it's like we have more control over a situation than we do. So we try to intellectualize or like really get down to the nitty gritty and like be almost too cerebral for our own good, where it's like, oh, this is happening exactly because of X, Y, and Z, when sometimes X, Y, and Z are totally irrelevant. And it just sort of gives us like this illusion of control over the situation. Something that I also sort of like too is that when things don't start going your way, when you live in a certain, when you're living out or carrying out a certain paradigm of what you believe to be like the ideal life, or not even that, but like when you're just living your life and you're not getting the results that you want, that typically means there's something like fundamentally wrong with the value structure that you're interpreting the world through, and sort of along the same vein of that sentence of that statement you made about your girlfriend. I wanted to know your perspective of that too. Like, how do you feel that fits in? Where it's like, oh, if the world isn't going, if the things around me aren't going the way that I want it to, is there something fundamentally wrong with like the value structure that I've set before myself? Because that's sort of something that he talks about too.
Yeah, I definitely was trying to think about that today. This past week, because it felt like a pretty rough week. I was like trying to think. I'm like, damn. I was like, at some points, I was thinking, it's like maybe I'm just depressed or something. But that could also be because I'm hanging around with a lot of psychiatric patients right now, so I might be displacing some things onto myself. But yeah, I was trying to think through that, where it's like, oh, if things are going wrong for me and like I'm really struggling right now, is it things happening to me that seem to be making this thing wrong? And I was like kind of reflecting and even thinking on it now. It's like, not really, because there wasn't anything bad happening to me this past week. Like, I have a longer commute than I'd like, but there's nothing like crazy. I didn't get attacked at work, or I didn't get, judged by my preceptor or someone else in the building. I didn't like lose or fail a test or anything like that. So I was like, oh, I think it's just like I just need to reframe what I'm
Mm.
doing, or figure what I'm doing wrong to get to my goals that's making me have such a rough week. And I think I'm doing a little better, like improving that, but it's always a work in progress. But yeah, I was thinking about that this week. But I was also trying to figure out and trying to think, what about those people who like it legit is not going well for them? Like they lose their job, their girlfriend dumps them, they whatever they have car troubles, and a tree falls on their house, and all these terrible. It's like, is that really you not structuring your worldview properly that's happening, or is there?
Mm.
I guess you also have to be prepared for something else when just life sucks.
Yeah, I think wow, you sort of brought like up a lot of stuff. I want to see if I
Yeah.
can try and like address each one of those things. So like from your sort of disposition right now, based on like the experiences that you've had over the past couple of weeks since we last spoke, I think I think what could be going on is that like, and this is sort of something that uh, Peterson also talks about in this chapter too. It's actually pretty remarkable how well we're able to like sort of see our lives like through the lens of these chapters. It's that like take the labels off of everything for a second with me, right? And then you look at the way, like, say, poor people look at the suffering, or like the the tribulations of the wealthy in a certain society. And let's say it's the US. Money doesn't abolish the issue of suffering. That's like innate to the human condition, right? So, but somehow we've negotiated within ourselves and within our, like, sort of socioeconomic strata, that there's something that's gatekeeping us from having, like, pure stuff that is having suffering, and it's like the wealthiest among us still get divorced, they still get cancer, their shit still stinks too, they still have terrible relations with their family. It just so happens that a lot of these issues don't come from the absence of money, or the absence, or like the lack of access to resource. It's like somehow, one way or another, it's like that yin yang thing. In a life that seems like perfectly orderly, somehow chaos will still find a way to, like, rear its ugly head and then just make you suffer, right? So I think, sort of taking that back to your own experience for the past 2 weeks, it's almost like you have this idea in your mind of what suffering is, or like what misery is. And because whatever you're feeling or whatever you're experiencing right now isn't checking off those boxes, because remember, again, like, these things are shaped based on our previous experience. It's like when they're not crossing off the boxes, you sort of, and I don't want to speak for you purely, so you correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like you almost sort of dismiss that as, like, suffering, or dismiss that as, like, depression, when it's like, oh, I'm still feeling these ways that, like, people have labeled as depression or anxiety or just misery. What is it about, like, my interpretation of, like, the situation that's wrong? Or it's like, what is it in my environment that's, like, influencing me to the point where I feel these ways? So it's like you're looking, you sort of look at it sounds to me that you're looking at one end of the tunnel when you should be looking at the other. And that's just sort of like my perspective of it. As for the second thing that you mentioned, that I low-key, like, starting to forget right now, I think you said something like, oh, if a tree falls on your neighbor, or, like, on someone that you love, how is that, like, how is that, like, something that's fundamentally wrong, and you're suffering from it? How is that something that's wrong with your value structure? I don't think those things, like, are necessarily, like, sequiturs, because in my mind it's like when you sacrifice something to bring about, like, a future that you wanted to manifest, when that happens, then that's something that's fundamentally something wrong with your value structure. But what you're sort of describing right now is also sort of just misfortune that befalls us in the world, and Dr. Peterson says that's, like, one of those things that just happens regardless of the things that we do, right? Because things just don't know how to just be good, right? Like, on their own. It's like you leave you leave your dishes, like, undone in the sink for, like, 2 weeks and come back to it, and it's like, oh, everything's clean now. No, it's all rubbish. There's, like, mold everywhere. There's, like, a rat that's like feeding on your scraps or whatever. It's like not all things come from, like, the result of us like enacting our will upon the world.
Yeah.
That was very
I think
verbose. I apologize.
no, I mean, I feel like I did the same thing right before. But yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head, where he said, um, the cause is instead that which is currently most valued subjectively and personally. Why? Because the world is revealed to an indeterminate degree through the template of your values, which I think is, like, textbook stoicism, where they have trying to think of the classic phrase where it's like, you can't change, like, whatever's going on around you, but you can change your reaction to it, which is basically kind of what he's saying, where it's like you have to structure your suffering and whatever's going on through a different template. So it's like, oh, That's why a lot of like the Stoic philosophy, and I'm kind of reading a little bit more into Buddhist philosophy with my girlfriend, is this idea that rather just realizing that things are going to go wrong and suffering, and the thing that you should be changing is what you're thinking yourself. So you can't, which kind of eliminates the issues of external factors, because then if, a tree does fall on your house, it's not going to affect you because your goals aren't aligned with having a tree not fall on your house. It's in this other realm where, he talks about that dream. Did he bring up the dream in this chapter? Where the dream with all the pyramids and stuff, where you're above all the pyramids. So, if you don't set your goals to be, oh, I need to have the nice house and the fancy car, if you set it on something else that's a different kind of hierarchy, it kind of relieves you of that issue of having to deal with suffering like that because your goals are something else, which I think is a lot deeper than what most people think of their goals as, like, oh, money and power, fame, or whatever. If you change your structured worldview to put at the peak the elimination of suffering and to improve yourself, you're going to be a lot happier, because then,
Mm.
like I said, the tree falling in your house doesn't actually change you making progress towards those goals.
Right. I think, especially when it comes, I feel as though the greatest thing that this sort of can sort of be be evident in is, like, say you have a friend that killed themselves, you know, and it's like one of the worst things that happens, aside from just the unnecessary loss of, innocent life, is that it's like the suffering that the that the person who committed suicide leaves behind, because people find themselves, like, in these internal monologues in their head where it's like, oh, what could I have done different? Like, I could have been nicer to them. I could have stopped in and said hi more, or it's my fault that I wasn't there for them when they needed me, and sometimes it's like, I'm not saying that's like the wrong way of thinking. It's a natural way of thinking, especially when it's when it happens to someone very close to you. But at the same time, it's like that type of conversation, like, that you have with yourself, where you're just putting yourself down for no good reason and you're making yourself suffer unnecessarily. That does no one any good, right? And in my mind, it's like we should work ourselves up to a point where it's like, and I think Peterson has said this before too in other interviews, where it's like we should strive to be the strongest person at, like, our loved one's funeral.
Yeah.
Where it's like, because I mean, it's inevitable that all people die. It's just a matter of how and when. And sort of given that just cruel reality of life, it's up to us to sort of prepare ourselves for that moment. And it's like, what does that look like? Maybe it looks like spending more meaningful time with the people that we love, or having those conversations with ourselves where it's where you're not denigrating yourself for no reason. It's like, oh, maybe I could have done this more. And it's like, okay, I will do this more, rather than just saying, oh, I'm such a terrible person for not doing this. Um,
Yeah, which I think that's where most, I mean, that's the goal of like CBT and stuff, is to find those thoughts that are running through your mind that are unhealthy or distorted, and to sort of correct them. So I think, I don't want to break HIPAA, but like I saw a patient this week who or was it this week? Yeah, it was earlier this week, where he saw something like horrific, and he was really beating himself up. And that's part of the reason why he had to come in to the psych ward, is because he kept thinking, he's like, oh, I saw the signs of this horrible thing happening, and like I feel like I could have changed stuff, and I could have reached out to this person when the horrible thing happened before, and all these things. And it's kind of what got him into. So I think part of it is like changing your frame of mind and catching those thoughts and changing them to tweak them, which again is then when physical things happen or external things happen, you're not having issues dealing with external factors. You're more dealing with internal, or your goals are aligned so that external factors don't change your goals because your goals aren't external.
Right.
Which I think I also like that story, Socrates in the middle there, where, you know, you're about to die and he's like, well, at least I'm not gonna have to suffer through illness or old age, or and all my friends know I've like lived a good life and stuff like that. Where yeah, changing your mindset is so important, which I think is basically the gist of this chapter is changing your mindset and your which way you've oriented your goals
Mm.
so that it decreases the suffering. And then on the external side, making part of your goals decreasing other suffering.
Right, and it's like a stepwise function too. I think, especially when it comes to like the sort of allegory that he makes to with Socrates and his final fate is that there are sometimes like worse things that can happen to you than just dying, right? And for myself, at least in this point at this phase in my life, it's it's sort of like the unfulfilled life, or it's like the unexamined life that's so much more scary than death, because the other way of looking at death, rather than just like this painful experience with no looking back, is like it's like the period of the last sentence of this book that of this book that you're trying to write, right? There's no going back and changing anything, and there's nothing else left on earth for us to sort of change for ourselves such that we can improve on for ourselves. So it's like at that point, like that's like when the package at Amazon is like already closed and shipped off to like its destination, right? You can't put more orders onto it. You can't like do anything else to it to make more things fit in the box, right? Sometimes you ordered like a pencil, and like you get this massive box and all that's in there is a pencil, right? And it's like, ah, oh, crap, I could have filled like stuffed animals with this that I could have given to my friends, or like this book that I was gonna read, or like these workout equipments that I could have used to like enhance like my physical shape. And for Socrates, it's like, oh, I've already done all these things with my life that I found to be so meaningful. And it's like it would almost be a shame to like watch myself waste away, because like in some aspects it's sort of like the measure of like your life is sort of like the things that you've done with your life. So like the value that you've accrued, or that you've taken away from not just your experience but also others. But also it's like perhaps the value of life can also be measured by like the nature of your death too. And that's sort of like really cool to me, where it's like the idea that you can abolish the need for fear of death because you've put so many things into that Amazon box that it's like, oh, looking back at it, there's literally nothing else that could have fit into it. There's literally nothing else that I could have done to make my situation or anyone else's situation better too. And that sort of like requires this sort of presence of mind that Peterson incorporates into this chapter too, right? Like that internal voice that he has with himself that kept him from doing things that he knew to be wrong, or like the things that keeps him doing the things that he knows to be true or virtuous, or like points him along the right path.
Yeah, which is why I like the quote, if I can get it right, where it's like, in every moment, think, is this worth doing? Which is great because it's like keeping you in that moment so that when you do get to that future point, rather than being focused on that future point, you're always focused, okay, I want to be whatever goals at that future point. So right now, what do I do that's going to improve myself right now? Which I think I had this kind of realization, I forget which day, because I was listening to one of his old like biblical lectures, and it just kind of came to me. It was like, oh, this whole distillment of his philosophy is like aim at like the highest thing you can do, and which in this chapter, he's mentioning is the first goal he had was eliminate unnecessary suffering. So that's a big goal. Like you're never going to achieve it, but then kind of go back down and find like the smallest unit that you could change of
Mm,
said goal, which I think is part of this chapter too, where it's like everything will start to align if you kind of have your goals set in that peak area, and then you're also coming back down to kind of live in the moment.
right.
Right now, in this tiny frame of time, what can I change right now that will get me towards that goal?
I think the other thing too to also consider as well is that sometimes you don't know what the right step is, you know, because a lot of times when you think about it, especially from like a utilitarian perspective, every action that you have has like this sort of opportunity cost to it too. If I do this, then I preclude myself from doing all these other things with my time too. If I choose to be a lawyer, that means I can't spend the next 3 years just partying around and then just uh, just living by my purely by my own compulsions, right? There's things that like preclude you from. There's things that you do that preclude you from doing other things too. So that sort of also speaks to this idea of not just what sacrifice is necessary, but what sacrifices are the right sacrifices that I need to make too. Um, because when you're living your life and you're trying to take these like minuscule steps toward like this ideal future that you have, not just for yourself but for your community, it's like, how do I know that these sacrifices are going to amount to anything too? How do I know that these sacrifices are going to put me in the position that I need to be to achieve my dreams or to achieve these like lofty goals that I have, you know? And for me personally, that's like one of the scariest things, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I'm gonna commit myself to 4 years of school, and it's
Yeah.
like all my friends already have homes, they have houses that they've already paid for, they're starting to like think about having families and stuff, and I can't do that right now, right? And it's like, how do I, like, I could end up like on the other side of this 4 year tunnel with absolutely nothing in my hands, you know? And then it's like,
Yeah.
oh crap, like maybe somewhere along the way I didn't make the right sacrifice, or maybe I sacrificed too much, or I shouldn't have sacrificed when I need to be more stingy, you know. So I think that not just like along that same vein of like rethinking like your thought process, but also just what sacrifices are the right sacrifices, and to where should we aim these sacrifices, you know. Um,
Yeah. And I think to having like a more holistic idea of what you want to be, because you can easily say, oh, I want to finish school to be a doctor or a lawyer, but if you spend all 4 years 24/7 focusing on just that, that's all you're going to have.
mm,
I think it is kind of sometimes worth it to, maybe you only get a B on your next test, but you've also like built friendships, or you've you read a book on philosophy, or you did something else that like improved you in a different way. I think it's okay, because then since you've set your goal just beyond I want to be a doctor, you've like, oh, I also want to be like a good doctor. Well, what's
mm,
that mean? It's like, oh, I want to be a good person. Well, I need to be a good person to be a good doctor. So what do I need to do to be a good person? Oh, so
mm,
sometimes I have to like read like for 15 minutes of my day about Socrates, or read a chapter of Jordan Peterson every week to improve myself as a person, to make myself a better doctor. So I might not be like the smartest doctor or know the most things about the most drugs, but I can also connect to my patients, and I'm a better person to them as well.
Yeah, I agree. And that sort of also requires you to have the presence of mind to fractionate the responsibilities of whatever it is that you're trying to manifest. So let's say you're trying to be a good doctor, right? I love that you're like, oh, for me to be a good doctor, first it requires me to like, like the gatekeeper to being a good doctor is being a good person first, right? Like I've sort of had the fortune of only having good doctors or like esteemable doctors in my life. But I mean, when I was going to college, I'd talk to some people that I'd be like, oh, they're pretty cool in like a party context, or like sitting right next to them in a classroom. They're totally fine. But there's no way in hell that I would want this person like take care of my mom, you know? And it's like these people are fun in the moment, but it's like when it comes down to like having difficult conversations, or uh, uh, asking them to like be more compassionate to like people in like really dire straits. It's like, I don't know if I can count on this person, or not even count on this person to like solving the problem. I don't even know if I can count on this person to be like emotionally present for like me and my family at like in whatever time of need that we find ourselves in, you know. And I think I think that's another thing too, because you look at yourself and you look at the conversations that you're having with yourself too, right? It's like, oh, I spent my entire weekend watching YouTube videos, playing video games, and not doing any studying for my next upcoming week. And it's like, okay, maybe I didn't take any time off like leading up to that weekend, like during the weekdays. And it's like, what would you tell your best friend at the time, where it's like, oh, they're working themselves to exhaustion, or you know, they haven't had a break in like months, and then they take a weekend off for themselves to like do things that helps like distract themselves from like the harsh realities of life. It's like, would you get on their case for it, or it's like, oh, you should be doing this, or you should be doing that. How dare you take time off? You know. And it's like, if you don't do that with your friends, then like, why would you do that to yourself? You know, you start to find like and then when you answer that question for yourself, you also sort of have this this also other conversation where it's like, well, what can we do about this? You know, what kind of value can we find from this situation? Yeah, that was a huge tangent.
Because I was about to say, I think I was also trying to figure out like, where do vacations come into this, you know? Where I was thinking about finding meaning, and I feel like most people nowadays, they it's the classic, you know, working for the weekend sort of mentality, or I'm working so that I can afford my fancy trip to Japan or the fancy cruise or whatever. And I was trying to think like, no wonder people are kind of miserable, is because their their main goals aren't what they're doing with their everyday lives. And I think that's one of the bigger problems, is why a lot of like depression and anxiety is increasing, is just because I don't think people are finding meaning in what they're doing in their everyday lives, or at least something beyond working for a break. But I was also trying to figure out, you can't always be working. So vacations and breaks need to be worked into it. But how do you do that responsibly without derailing yourself from your like improving yourself or meeting your goals, you know?
Right. The other issue too that sort of like extends from the thing that you're positing is that not all people have like the disposition or like the capacity to be an NBA player. They don't all have the virtues or the grit that it takes to be like a doctor, or they don't have like the linguistic skills to be, you know, a crazy good lawyer, you know. And sometimes like sometimes it's just almost impossible to find value of, you know, flipping burgers at McDonald's, you know, or being a waitress, or, you know, doing any one of these millions of things that, like, you know, just seem like menial jobs that lead to very, you know, what some people would think lead to very little job satisfaction too, you know. And the tragic thing is that like, or even plumbing, you know, and it's like the tragic thing is that like we still need those people, you know, like we still need everyone in society to play their role. And that doesn't mean anyone's role is like any more, like makes their humanity any more or less than the next person, right? So it's really not only is it like understandable, but it's also tragic, because in some ways it's like, yeah, we need these people to do their jobs. We need these people to like go on these like 100-foot like poles and make sure the electricity is still running from city to city. Like we need these people to like go like wade like waist deep in like sewage to make sure that everyone else can live a, you know, clean, like disease-free life, you know, and or you know, go on these like high rises and work thousands of feet in the air, risking your life. And it's like, you know, sometimes the meaning doesn't come from the work itself. Sometimes the meaning just comes from like the camaraderie that you build from just being with the people within the trade, you know. And it's like
Yeah.
I've only done so many like weird jobs that like I can't empathize with like everyone. I can't empathize with like a plumber. I can't empathize to the same level that like I could with like a construction worker. But I still acknowledge like their necessity, you know. But at the same time, it's also like it's hard to just tell them, "Hey, man." It's like how do you have that conversation with them? You know, it's like, "Hey,
Yeah.
man, I know your life sucks and like your job is terrible, but like you just gotta think positive." You know, sometimes that's like the last thing someone needs to hear. You know, and it's like,
Yeah.
what kind of business do I have telling a person to like change their mentality when they're doing things that I can't even like comprehend doing? Um,
I think I
it's tough.
I think ironically once I forget what the stat was, but it's something like the average like blue collar worker is actually more content than the average white collar worker, something like that. It's something to do with like Mike Rowe and that dirty
Oh,
jobs
I
sort
love
of
that
deal.
show.
Whereas yeah, whereas like yeah, guys who clean like septic tanks and garbage men, they're actually like on average happier than doctors or lawyers and stuff, which it may be people, just with that predisposition end up being there or something about being a type A personality, but I'm assuming there's something there that people can be content, just being a well-paid garbage man or a guy who has to work in like disgusting sewers. Um,
Yeah,
which I think is also indicative as I think there's been a little more of an insurgence online if you're online like on Twitter enough and stuff where there's kind of this resurgence of socialism being a little more in vogue and stuff like that. Where I don't think a lot of these people, and it's a meme that these people don't realize people are still going to have to do these shitty jobs in your socialist utopia. Like you're not getting out of it, and you'll see these threads where it's like, "Oh, what are you going to do in the socialist world?" And they're like, "Oh, I'm going to be an artist, and I'm going to be a this and that." Where it's like, you're probably not. You're still going to have to do shitty things. Where I think that's where looking for their meaning is like, here's something that brings me joy, so I want to do that rather than like here's something I need to do, so here's me finding meaning in it. And then like yeah, I can find joy in other things in my hobbies and stuff, but I still need to find meaning in my shitty dead end job or whatever.
Yeah, I think part of like the problem of that too is that like, and you know I definitely fall victim to this a lot all the time, where it's where you where it's too hard to find meaning in your own life that you rely on someone else or something else to sort of find that for you, right? So I think when people this goes back to like the classic Nietzsche, like a Nietzsche quote where it's like God is dead, he is dead because we have killed him. And then Peterson says in this chapter that when you kill like the idea of God, let's say something has to rise up and take its place, right? And for the longest time, like within recorded history, or at least within Judeo-Christian history, that God has sort of served as like this north star for everyone to like sort of use as their barometer for am I working towards like a meaningful life, you know? And then it's like when you abolish that, the the natural the natural supplement to fill that role is like the state. And I think he said Nietzsche predicted that too, where it's like the state will start to like do these things for you, and you do see these like things in like communist states where people have very little freedom. Sure, everyone's like sort of on the same playing field, but it's like how many people really get to do what they want to do? You know, like people almost get assigned their roles, or like they get regardless of like their say in the matter, you know, and they look to other things to give them that responsibility that that was too difficult for us to sort of like concoct within our own minds, and I think that's dangerous too, because it's like the same issues that people, or the same gripes that people have with religion, they can typically also be found like on the level of like the state too, where it's like, oh, there's corruption in government too. Oh, there's like a list of things that we don't necessarily know how to interpret, whether it's like word for word or like we should take it like from a figurative perspective that also exists like within the scope of the law too. That's why lawyers exist.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think the average person, I don't want to sound pretentious or anything, but I don't think the average person really delves deep, and there's definitely things we don't either, delves really deep into a lot of their core beliefs. And I think what happens just often is the state or whatever, pick your ideology, can kind of become religion, which is why I think politics is becoming a lot bigger right now, is because more and more people are not religious, so they need something new to
mm,
fill in that kind of void that religion.
wow. Okay.
So now they have ideology is kind of filling that void, and then you like you said, you get all those classic gripes of, it's like people criticizing, you Christians just believe everything the Bible says without thinking about it, where it's like, yeah, well, I can definitely point to a million people online that are just following the tenets of, pick your philosopher here, or socialism, or Democrat or Republican, or libertarian, whatever you want to pick. It's like, yeah, you guys have those people too, and there's actual people who think about it,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then there's all the quote unquote that follow your ideology.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like we gotta dig a little deeper when it comes to like what the word God even means. It's like, oh, this it's like this bearded white dude in the sky, and it's like, no, let's get a little more sophisticated than that. One of the things I absolutely like, I'll never forget like him saying this, but like Peter said in one of the Rogan podcasts that he was featured in, is like, whatever is like a person's like highest like moral rule or moral ideal, that's their God. Like, it serves their life to the degree that like conventionally God has served for like the Christians, right? So when you look at something like that, where it's like, oh, you work towards like this idea of like a utopia, this utopia that has no need for God, right? And it's like suddenly you rely on the government to tell you everything of what's right, what's wrong, what's sanctioned, what can we do to like, what can we do in terms of like punitive measures or enforcing the law onto its citizens. It's like all these things too. They all serve like, they all cross off the same boxes that God does too. And it's sort of just a matter of whether or not we're aware of like aware of like the meta conversation that we're having at this time. And sort of this also brings us back to like the idea of religious freedom, like moral or virtuous freedom, and dogma. Because I feel as though that's sort of like those are like the two aspects of modern Christianity that most people most people tend to find themselves having conversations about, where it's like, oh, being a part of like a religion entails like all these responsibilities or all these things, or all these expectations for us too. And that's all rooted in dogma that we can, question ad nauseum too. But it's also like that idea that Jocko talks about too, where within that discipline you find your freedom. You don't just feed your kids like whatever they want. You give them vegetables for like 20 years, and then you're like, oh, okay, look at how good off you are right now. You can choose your way in life, but at least at least you did what you had to do to get to this point where you have the ability to ask yourself the proper questions to live a more meaningful life.
Yeah. Which I don't I don't know, I was just thinking, with this whole like finding meaning and discipline, and I'm reading a separate book with my girlfriend about, it's called Buddha's Brain, and there's a section in there where it's like, if you really think about it, when you do what is expedient, you eat that ice cream, like, how good does it actually taste after your first few bites, Or if you put this into like other categories, like, how good does it feel to play a couple levels of Mario until you're just kind of zoned out and you're still playing, and it's like lost that kind of thing, which is I think why it feels so good to be more disciplined with your time, because then you're enjoying those peaks more than if you just keep doing the expedients, and I think that's what gives you the meaning. Is it's this longer term. You're not just looking for the next peak in happiness or whatever. You're trying to keep that kind of higher. It's almost like rather than having to go up and down in an oscillating wave, you have a higher. You may not hit those peaks as well, but you also don't hit those valleys as much, and you have this more baseline happiness, which I really don't like the word happiness, but it's kind of the better way to describe it.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think part and parcel of what does happen there too is that when you off put, it's like that marshmallow thing, right? Where it's like, oh, I don't want one marshmallow right now when I could wait like an hour and get two marshmallows, right? It's sort of
Yeah.
it's sort of like the joy of anticipation for a better future, right? That sort of colors like the sort of palette of meaning that we're sort of like trying to find within ourselves, you know. And I think that's also something that I see in professional athletes too, where it's like, oh, they've hit the pinnacle of performance within their craft or within their sport, you know. And it's like once professional athletes have like signed their contracts or like made the championships or done the impossible. Sometimes they just find themselves like asking themselves what's next. It's like I've reached this I've reached the apex only to realize that I have to do it all over again. And it's sort of also like the idea of like enjoying your ice cream right now too, but on a grander scale. And
Yeah.
in some ways that's also like a flawed approach to life too, where you're looking for this ultimate payoff when it's like it's really not promised. And who's to say it'll sustain you for the rest of your life too? It's impossible, right? So it's like that. It's like, what's the most meaningful value that we can strive towards in the future? Maybe it's making sure that our kids never have to go hungry. Maybe it's that, oh, I never have to get into marital problems because we can't manage our finances properly, or I'm not able to provide for my kids because I have an alcohol problem right now, or I'm not able to be present for my kids because I have an alcohol problem, or something like that. And it's like even though we've sort of changed like the dimensions or like the time horizon for some of these payoffs, just sort of almost like the nature of expecting that payoff at the end is like having you play like the fool's game, where it's like, oh, I'm expecting this to like solve all of my problems. It's like, nah, man, like problems will still come too. So maybe like the best solution is to get you that secret sauce of, or like get you that find you that meaning that helps you when times are bad, rather than trying to prepare for like a good time. That sounds weird.
Which I was gonna say, I think that's like what does kind of solve it, because I can't tell you how many times in the past 2 weeks I've been interviewing. I mean, I don't know if I've said here, but I've been in an inpatient psych ward for school for about 2 weeks now, and I can't tell you how many times when you notice that a patient is getting ready to actually get out after they've had like a severe depressive episode or something, they're always one of the things we always chart is they're now future focused and goal oriented. Because I can't tell you how good of a sign it is when you see a patient where they came in and they're just like, oh, I feel like impending doom. I can't get anything in my life together. And then a few days later, after they've kind of gone through the program, they're saying things where it's like, I'm still a little sad and I'm still a little anxious, but it's over things I can work towards. And it's like, oh, I need to see my kids and I want to get back to work. I want to do all these things. So I think like it's kind of getting back to that framing of your mind, or once you have a goal in mind, I think that really improves your outlook on life, because you're actually working towards things that you can fix rather than just kind of not having a meaning or not having an idea of what you want to be, even if it is something kind of more external. Like I know I've probably sounded like in this whole talk about being kind of against trying to focus on external things, but there are external things that are good, like your having children and raising a good
Mm.
family or something like that. And I think that's would improve a lot of people's lives if they started having little goals or better goals, kind of like that, you know?
Yeah, it's kind of I think that like just hearing that like sounds like so reassuring. You know, when you hear people that are becoming more mindful of the future, but also
Yeah.
they become more mindful of their agency to bring about a future. You know, like that's such a crazy thing. And I think one of the dangers too that we have right now is that like I feel as though like collectively as a society we have to find ways to like address these on like every single level of like our, or at least as many levels of our existence as possible, because the thing that's sort of on our horizon right now as human like as humanity, speaking as you know, a human being, is that like uh, artificial intelligence and everything that brings to the table. Like I mean sure, it brings like a lot of like efficiency and productivity, but at the same time it brings like all these new problems too. But that brings problems because like it brings problems up that we thought we had addressed previously that um, are starting to bubble to the surface. So what does that look like? It's like, oh, the unexamined life, or oh, I need to find ways to still make sacrifices, or I have to still find ways to like create this vision for a future for myself, and then also determine what are the necessary sacrifices for these things, you know. And then sometimes when we introduce innovation or like technology into these realms where we're starting to put people out of work, it's like, well, now we've eliminated their avenue to like finding their meaning of life entirely, you know. Like farmers getting put out of work even though they've worked on like their family farm their entire life. Now like say 50% of their work has been replaced by a machine. You know, this is all just me talking out of my butt. But you know, the issue still stands where it's like, oh, when we eliminate these like times or like this space that humans fundamentally need, like we need this struggle to like find self-actualization. When we eliminate that struggle and just start living a sweet life, you know, it's like how are we going to deal with that? Are we going to deal with it by creating problems for ourselves? You know, because I feel as though that's sort of that's what we're seeing right now. You know, people starting to fan like internet wars, fan the flames of internet wars for no good reason. You know, and it's like this person that you've never met before. You know, we're creating problems for ourselves.
Or you know, it's like people complaining about man spreading on the bus, or trying to
Oh
think of
Jesus
like a
Christ! Yeah, dude, just put like two kiwis next to your legs, and you tell me how
yeah.
like, how comfortable that is. You know?
I'm trying to think of like the right wing equivalent where like you know, you've seen on both sides of like
Oh yeah, of
politics where
course.
things where if you're kind of not in that bubble, you're just like, this is a non-issue. Like, why do you care about X, Y, or Z? Why do you care about man spreading, or why do you care about what people do in the privacy of their own bedrooms? You know, like I feel like people have to find when. Also, the kind of the sad part is there's plenty of issues to solve in the world yet. You know, like when's the last time you heard about Yemen or like the like I'm guessing if I Googled it right now that the Flint water crisis is probably still happening and just no one cares because you know
Actually, I
something
looked
else.
that up a few days ago, just because like one of my friends here is from Flint, and
Oh
it was
yeah.
like, yeah, the water issues like sort of largely been like addressed, but like the bigger
Oh,
issue is that people have distrust of the government now, you know,
oh.
and it's like, yeah, that makes sense.
Or you know, I think like we're talking more about like we need to do retributive justice and all these things for historical wrongs where it's like, all right, well, maybe after we just solve like what's happening right now, like can we solve what's causing issues right now and then we could talk about this later. But I feel like you said, more people are trying to make problems rather than actually come to solutions, where I think there's like a little comic where someone's like, "Oh, I'm mad at this," and the person's like, "Oh, well, here's a solution," and they have like a folder with this labeled solution, and the guy who's mad, he's like grabs it. It's like, "No, I don't want solutions. I just want to be mad," and he burns the folder.
Wait, that's actually so funny. And the
Yeah.
crazy thing is that's true too. It's like if you ever played like a sport or like any situation where you needed to be on a team environment, the
Hmm.
easiest thing to do is like wait for someone to bring up an issue, and then everyone chimes in. They're like, "Yeah, that's a problem. I fucking hate it when that happens." Like, "Yeah, this is terrible." Blah blah blah. And you're just like starting to find like new things. Oh, this person never does this either.
Yeah.
And it's like it's so much easier, and it's like so much more, maybe not exhilarating, but like it's so much easier to just bring up a problem rather than finding like an actual meaningful solution to a problem. It's almost as though like people, and I've done this too, where it's like you bring up a problem and you give yourself a pat on the back and you're like, good for me. I've brought up the existence of this problem. My work here is done. Someone else can do all the cleanup and the hard work and stuff. And the terrible thing is that like a lot of the hard work just comes from like understanding other people's perspectives. It's not even like necessarily just finding like the resources and all that stuff. It's like working around other people too, or like coming to understand other people's perspectives. And that's just only the biggest problem, because it's so much easier to just exist within the church of our own minds. It's so much easier to just dismiss another person's problem as just like, or another person's perspective as, oh, this is useless. I know exactly what's right. And that's a problem that's like fundamental to every human being.
Yeah.
Um,
I was gonna say, just like the next time you hear some pundit or like politician on the news, just like try and be aware of how much, when you listen to their speech, how much of the time are they bringing up problems that are wrong and not actually saying a solution to said problem. It's like Trump being like, "Oh, they're crossing the border. There's too many immigrants. They're flooding the system." How much of his speech is just yelling about immigration or the Democrats doing something wrong, and like how much of his speech is dedicated to, now here's what I'm gonna do to fix it. It's like,
yeah.
no, we kind of do that.
Did you
But I
hear
was gonna
the Jocko response to like how he thought Biden should have responded to the Afghanistan situation?
No, was that I saw a video that said like if Jocko was president. Is that
Yeah,
what you're
yeah, that
talking
was the
about?
video. Did you see that?
No, I didn't watch it. Is
I
it?
I, I think it's pretty great. I think you should watch it, especially as a Jocko fan. Like,
Yeah.
like it's pretty good. But you were saying though, sorry.
Um, Shoot. I was gonna say, well, part of in the future it's gonna be, you said something about looking what other people have, like their ideas or something. I forget which I was gonna point out. It's like, oh look, that's I'm starting to realize as we talk how many of the other rules again get incorporated into this,
Mm,
which I think is a testament, because like you said earlier, and I was gonna say too, where I think this is the chapter that he builds to and around, which it may not be the center rule, but it's definitely like, I think the point of this book is how do you find meaning, and all the other rules are either what you should be doing to like set yourself up for the most success in finding meaning, or what are some rules in order to keep finding your meaning.
right. And the crazy thing too is that like sometimes like the answers to some of these problems exist on like the polar opposite of what you expect. You know, one of the quotes that I love from this chapter is that I think I wrote it down somewhere and I don't have the book on me, but it's like trees cannot grow to heaven if its roots don't go down to hell. Where it's like you have to
Yeah.
acknowledge the entire spectrum of like the experience, like of any given experience, both good and bad, for you to understand like what it takes to have or find redemption. And when I hear something like that, and then you're sort of the things that you were describing too, it's also like what does it take for you to live a meaningful life? Well, maybe you should start thinking about what does it mean to have to have a meaningful death. And that's the reason why he brings up the Socrates analogy. um, and sometimes it's like, how can you find peace in your death? And it's like, well, it's by living like the fully examined or like the most meaningful life that you could have concocted for yourself. And it's kind of crazy too, because it's like for you to realize like one particular aspect of like an issue, especially like this sort of like archetypal issues that have like affected literally every human being. It's like you need to dig really deep, man. And like you gotta look in the places that no one wants to look, you know. And it's like, oh, meaningful life. What's the first thing I should think of? No one thinks, oh, what if I die? You know? Or it's like, what if I die and I didn't live a meaningful life? And you're like, oh crap, like now I really gotta like get my shit together and figure out what it is to make a meaning, like have a meaningful life. Or, oh, what does it mean to like have a good family like relationship? And it's like you start thinking to yourself, what's the worst possible family relationship that I could have? Or what's the worst possible future that I could create for myself too? And you know, it's sort of beautiful too, because I feel as though almost everything he does, Dr. Peterson, that is, like sort of it dances around like this rule. Like even his future authoring program, like I don't know if you've heard of it. I'm sure you have if you've like listened to enough of his stuff. But it's like
Pretty sure.
but it's like this idea of like what does like what do you want in your future? And then part of that is also creating like this dystopian future for yourself where it's like, oh, what if you never achieve that? It's like what's the worst thing that could happen to you in 5 years if you continue to do things that you know to be like bad for you? And it's like, oh, I get cancer if I keep smoking, or oh, I have a terrible relationship with my family, or I'm still single and alone when I'm like 50, you know? It requires you to like dig down to like the depths of hell, like dig down to like the worst possible experience that you can create for yourself, for you to realize not just like the answer but also the importance of finding such an answer.
Yeah, which I really liked that section on meaning as the higher good. I don't. It's on page like 198 where he starts getting into kind of being humble and getting rid of your pride, which is where I realized kind of that was reminded of that classic Bible verse that's like pride. The root of all sin is, or pride is like the root of all sin, where it was like, yeah, that's kind of where everything branches off. If you're not humble enough to kind of examine yourself and to look at where you're failing and what you're doing, you're not going to either make any improvement, or you're going to be destined for evil, which kind of like one of the things I was watching when I was supposed to be studying this week was this video. I don't know if you know who Vosh is, but he's kind of this like Twitch streamer. He's a socialist, and there's a guy who made a video called Vosh is unironically evil. And I watched that, and I kind of read this chapter as well. And it all just comes down to pride, where this guy Vosh unironically is evil because he's so sure of his worldview and where his goals are that he's willing to do all these other things. And the video kind of culminates in the end of being like, yeah, this guy, his moral view is because he is so correct in what he wants to do in the world, he's willing to do anything for it, which kind of goes back to, you know, like the Cain example, where Cain saw Abel and was like, Cain didn't reflect upon himself. He was so arrogant that he was like, no, God is wrong, or Abel's wrong, or something's wrong, and I need to kill whatever else it is out there and improve so that I'm the peak, you know, rather than reflecting inward and trying to improve his goals. He had to kill whatever was better than him, basically.
Yeah, it's actually I love that you brought that up, because that like I love mythology, and one of the examples he also brings into this chapter is also like the mythology of Horus and Set. Like like Horus is the son of Osiris. I used to be so like I love this story, and one of the funniest things about the story is that like Set and Horus have like this eternal battle between each other. Well, maybe it's not eternal, but it's like they have this like back and forth battle with each other to like show who's like superior, essentially. And this is after I think Set killed his father Osiris and chopped him into a bunch of pieces or whatever, and like sent him into the underworld or whatever. I can't remember the exact details of the story, but one of the key like features of that story is that in his battle with Set, he loses his eye. And Horus is like represented as like this hawk or like a falcon or an eagle, and like these birds of prey are like renowned for having like their tremendous like visual prowess, right? Like they can see their prey when they're circling above them, like miles, like literally miles above their heads. But like even with like all that like visual power, like he still loses his eye to evil. And the crazy thing is too is that it was necessary. He says to Dr. Peterson also says like it's necessary for you to perhaps lose a part of yourself such that the remainder of you can be redeemed. And that's exactly what happens. Horace loses his eyes and sight, but he gets something like even better. He gets insight into like the nature of like what evil truly is. There's also another battle where like I think he tries to like get his semen inside of Set, so he jerks off into like Set's favorite food, which is a salad, and then convinces him to eat it. It's a crazy story. But like this is definitely not kid friendly. But
No.
but like but I love that because a lot of what happens too, because like I think Horace served as like one of the like the progenitors to like the Christ figure, and that part of that is like sacrificing an aspect of yourself so you can reach self-actualization. And what does that require? That requires humility. It requires you to like leave your pride at the door, and that's exactly what happens too. It's actually funny that you mentioned Vosh, because like I think I saw a video of Vosh's like up here in my recommended this week, and I was like, oh, that's strange. But I'm definitely gonna have to watch that, like Vosh is evil now too. And it's kind of crazy because like one of the aspects of why Horace wins his fight with Set is because he chooses to surrender the part of him that is no longer useful to him or no longer serves him. And that requires humility, or the acknowledgement of, oh, I'm not a perfect individual, right? And for me to like confront like evil at its purest form, I have to give up something that that's like truly like meaningful to me, which is like the gift of my vision, such that I can continue to fight evil. It's insane. I think just also like he doesn't miss a beat at all in this chapter. Like I can't think of a single aspect of this chapter that I would get rid of, because I feel as though it would just take away from like the overall like flow and also the message that he's trying to convey. I really think this is like probably one of his best works.
Yeah. Which I was gonna say, I'm kind of surprised. I know he's more of an Old Testament sort of guy, but I'm surprised I don't know if I've ever heard him bring up the New Testament idea of you have to die to yourself and kind of be reborn, which is like really big. Where I was that came up when I was reading this or listening, because I listened to the Cain and Abel lecture, which obviously goes along well with this chapter. And I forgot about this. He actually reads from this chapter before the book was published while giving his Cain and Abel lecture.
Really?
Yeah. So I was like, oh, I just read that. As I was listening, I was like, because I couldn't find the 12, because I know when he does his 12 rules, every lecture he tried to do like one rule, and like he went like 1 through 12, and then I think he did it backwards, so I couldn't figure out which one was which. But anyways, I was surprised he didn't bring up the New Testament idea of dying to yourself, which is really similar to the Horace thing, and being born again in Christ, where you need to kind of kill off that parts of you which are not giving you meaning or not bringing yourself to your goals, so you can be reborn. And I know in the lecture he brings up the metaphor of the phoenix, where the phoenix literally burns up and is reborn. And he says like, being burnt up and kind of dying to yourself is really a really painful and hard and difficult process. But I think that's part of what gives you meaning, is going through, rather than going through external suffering that's been imposed on someone else, it's putting yourself through voluntary suffering so that you can achieve something, which I think is also part of this chapter. I don't know if I just came to that realization now, or it's kind of stewing, where part of deciding you're going to suffer either way. So a more meaningful way to suffer is to make your suffering your own suffering imposed on yourself rather than external.
Yeah, I think it's also empowering too in some senses too, because it's like people. I feel as though people hardly ever like perceive suffering as like a means to like self-actualization, or like they feel as though suffering like empowers them, except for like maybe like people like Jocko and Goggins. But I mean, like you still get to pick your poison, right? So like that's something. And then also another thing too, where I've heard Peterson say like you get to pick your poison. You get to choose which avenue that you suffer along. And also, it's like you're a lot tougher than you think, And And a lot of times too, when you undertake, like you voluntarily undertake your own suffering, not only are you able to contend with like that harsh reality, you come to a better place than rather than if you were like subjugated by external forces. Because I feel as though that brings like a whole litany of other issues too, where it's like, oh, how could this have happened? Like these questions that you ask yourself, how could this have happened to me? What are things that I could have done differently and stuff like that? And these are all things that like could have been avoided if you chose to address the issue before it even became an issue to begin with too. You sort of realize, oh, these aspects of my personality, they have a deadline. And it's like after that deadline is reached, then only bad things will happen. And I feel as though not only like is this an issue, I also actually think this is a bigger issue for men than it is for women, because I feel as though like just from a reproductive perspective, the idea of like, oh, I have a timeline is like a lot more self-evident to women, obviously because they go through menopause, right? But men are always like given like this sort of idea that oh there's still time, right? I can still have kids when I'm 60, but it's also like, should I have kids when I'm 60, and why can't I have them earlier, or what would it take for me to have them like at the right time, and I don't know. I feel as though that's like another thing too. That's another aspect of why Dr. Peterson's work appeals more so. Like it seems like he has a larger male audience than female audience. Is because females are sort of like, I feel as though they've always been given that sort of like ultimatum, and then Dr. Peterson's like, okay, you got to do this to yourself, guys. It's like the world isn't just going to do this for you, and you kind of have to figure it out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think I think this is a great conversation, and like for me, this is definitely a chapter I don't know so much about how much I'll revisit the other chapters, but this is probably something I'll have to like revisit like maybe every like twice a year or like once a year, just because I feel as though there's only so much that we can like discuss within this chapter, but because it's targeting such a meaningful question, like the nature of good and evil. Like you can revisit this chapter like millions of times and still find something more to talk about the next time you talk about it. So I mean, I think this is great. I appreciate everyone tuning in. And you got anything else to say?
No, I was about to say the same thing. There's so many detours I feel like we could have taken. Like, I think we only mentioned Cain and Abel once, which there's a whole massive discussion about that.
Yeah.
And there's a whole discussion. I had like a little note. I guess I was just looking at my notes and being like, well, I don't want to talk forever, but I definitely still have like a few notes that we could probably go off on another 2-hour tangent. But yeah.
Yeah, no kidding. And
I think definitely
something I noticed too. Oh, sorry.
if you
Hello?
I was gonna say, if you had to pick any chapter to read, it'd definitely be this one. Or if you kind of want an audio version that's not this, definitely listen to the Cain and Abel lecture. Was the one that I started because I recently started listening because I have like a 30-40 minute commute every day.
Oh,
So that's like an hour every day.
Actually, in the audiobook of this chapter, he actually starts crying like towards the end. It's actually really quite moving. When he's
I
talking,
meant to look it up. I heard that he cries when he reads the audiobook, but I didn't know where.
yeah, it's towards the end of this chapter where he's talking about like a beauty and meaning through art, and like the necessity of it to combat like the unnecessary suffering of the world. And it sort of like speaks to how deep of an issue this was for Dr. Peterson, to the point where he committed like literally his life to the analysis of good and evil. And it's like this is just his way of expressing it, And yeah, man, that shit will make a grown man cry. But yeah, I had a lot of the notes too. But honestly, something I noticed like halfway through the conversation is that like if I continue to like just go down these like bullet by bullet, like it just doesn't feel like a true conversation anymore, So I think this will definitely be something we have to revisit in the future. Maybe not like within the near future, but a year from now, I think we definitely have another good conversation about it. What do you think?
Yeah, have a delayed think back on each book we read or something.
Yeah, I think that'd be great, or at least for this book, just because there's so much meat and potatoes to it. But yeah, anyways, thanks everyone for tuning in this week to the Menno and Squares Book Club. We're going to do Rule 8 next week. See y'all then. Peace.